Girls don't belong here. My father said those words to me for the first time when I was 9. He said them for the last time 3 weeks ago, a hand's width from my ear, in the indoor pistol range he called his kingdom. And then the whole room went dead silent. Not ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that crashes down over a crowded place when someone has just seen a thing their brain hasn't caught up enough to name. 4 of my father's friends, middle-aged men in tactical vests still creased from the factory, had been laughing out loud a moment before. Now they stood frozen. The paper target slid back along the overhead track, stopped in front of me, and on it there was only one hole. One single hole, torn open through the dead center of the 10 ring, at 7 meters, after 5 rounds. The owner of the range, a man I had never met before in my life, stepped past my father as if my father were a chair. He pulled the target off the clip. His hand, a hand that had lifted more guns than I could count, was not entirely steady. My heart, which should have been pounding the way a normal person's heart would in a moment like that, instead slowed to 60 beats a minute. My spine straightened on reflex. I bit down lightly on the inside of my cheek and tasted that familiar copper. You don't cry when you take a hit. You assess the threat. Then you decide. But before I tell you what that man was about to say, and why those words would unravel everything my father had ever built up about himself, I want to ask you something. If you like stories like this one, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened next, no one in that room saw coming. But to understand it, you need to know why a man who once said girls don't belong here stood frozen in the very room he called his own. To understand, you have to go back 29 years. To the afternoon an old man put the first rifle in my hands, and said one thing to my father that I have never been able to forget. My name is Kathleen Brennan. My family calls me Katie. For 20 years, my parents believed I wore the uniform to do a dull, tedious job. Taking inventory. Cleaning. Keeping records. They believed I was the person standing in a cold storage room on some base, counting the rifles other people would carry off to shoot. Close to guns my whole life, but never actually pulling a trigger for anything that mattered. I let them believe it. I'll explain why. But the story doesn't start there. It starts with my grandfather. We called him Pop. Ray Brennan. A Marine who had been through Vietnam and come home with a name in the shooting world that the men there said in a lowered voice. He had a badge called the Distinguished Rifleman, the kind you can't buy, can't ask for, can only shoot your way into, and very few people in history have ever reached it. He kept it in a small wooden box, and opened it only once a year, on the birthday of the friend who had died in his place in some rice paddy. The summer I was 9, Pop took me out behind the house, to a row of tin cans set on a log. He knelt down behind me, placed a small rifle in my hands, and said in the hoarse voice of a man who had smoked too many cigarettes and shouted too many orders, "Don't hold your breath. Sweetheart. Just let the breath go out on its own. Shoot in the quiet space between 2 heartbeats." I hit all 7 cans. 7 for 7. My father stood at the back door, a beer in his hand, and said it loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Dad, come on. Girls don't belong here. Now she's going to think she can actually do something." Pop didn't turn his head. He just took a coin out of his pocket. A brass coin worn smooth at the edges, with something stamped on both faces that it took me years to be able to read. He pressed it into the palm of my hand, closed my tiny fingers around it, and said, still without looking at my father, "She belongs here more than you ever did, Frank." I was 9. I didn't understand all of it, but I saw the way my father's face changed. Not anger. Something worse than anger. Something that caved in. And I remember gripping that coin so hard it left a mark in my palm, because I knew, in the way children know things they aren't supposed to know, that I had just been given something, and at the same moment, my father had just lost something, and the two things were stuck together. That was between me and Pop. My father had no part in it. My father had served too. Army, one tour, the late 70s, in a place where no one shot back at him. He never said that part outright. He talked about his time in service in sentences left blank in the middle, for the listener to fill in. His whole life was a race against Pop's shadow, a race he knew he had lost from the starting line, and I think that's why he hated that backyard so much. Because there, the talent he never had ran straight through him, skipped over him, and landed on a 9-year-old girl. Pop taught me for 8 years. I grew up in the smell of gun oil and burnt coffee, in the sound of him calling the wind. In the mornings he woke me before the sun to get to the range while the air was still. He didn't teach me to shoot so I'd become a soldier. He taught me to shoot because he saw something in me that no one else in the house was willing to see. The year I was 17, he took me to a fixed-distance shooting match for young people, at a range called Ridgeline, about an hour's drive from home. He signed me up. He stood at the 500-yard line with me, using his own old bolt rifle, with iron sights, nothing to help, and he said, "Read the wind, Katie. Don't think." Read. I shot a number the organizers made them remeasure 3 times. They engraved my name on a brass plaque, hung in the glass case in the back room, over by the long-range bays. Kathleen Brennan, 2003. 500 yards. Iron sights. Pop cried that day. I had never seen him cry, not even at funerals. He just stood looking at that plaque for a long while, then patted my shoulder once, and said, "There. Now they'll have to see you." 3 months later, Pop was gone. His heart stopped in his sleep, as gentle as the way he had taught me to shoot, in the quiet space between 2 beats. I enlisted in the Marines the next year, 18 years old. And something in me closed at the same moment as the lid of his coffin. The only person who had ever seen me was gone. My father waved off my enlistment like waving off a fly. My mother worried I'd never find a husband. So I stopped telling them. I let them think I did something small and safe. Setting the record straight felt like bragging, and I had no one left to brag to. 20 years passed like that. 3 deployments. Things I didn't talk about at the dinner table. Then I became an instructor, the person who teaches young troops how to read the wind, how to breathe, how to find the quiet space between 2 heartbeats, exactly the way Pop had taught me. My own Distinguished Rifleman badge sat in a box, next to Pop's, in the bottom drawer of the apartment I rented. No one in the family knew it existed. 3 weeks ago, I came home on leave, right around my mother's birthday. I drove my 10-year-old pickup down the familiar road, and I told myself, like every time, this is 1 weekend. Just 3 days. Then I leave again. In my left breast pocket, I carried Pop's coin. I always carry it. It was the only thing in that house that had ever told me I belonged somewhere. That evening at dinner, my father had a new hobby. He'd been retired 3 years, and in those 3 years, he had been reborn as a different man. A gun guy, a club man, a little king at a local range. He talked about ammunition the way you'd talk about theology. He wore a tactical vest to dinner. And halfway through the meal, he set down his fork, looked at me across the plate of chicken, and announced to the whole table, "This weekend I'm taking Katie out to the range. Show her which end the bullet comes out of. Don't worry, honey, I'll stand right behind you so you don't shoot yourself in the foot." My father's friends laughed. My mother cut her chicken into tiny little pieces, anxious, and said, "Yes, go and get some fresh air, honey." Then my father did something that, at the time, I had no idea was him digging his own grave. He said, still in that boasting voice, "That range has an old record plaque in the back room. Some Brennan name. Probably a distant relative, from way back. Different era. Doesn't count. I'll take you to my line. Pistol, real distance." I let that sentence fall onto the table and lie there. I said nothing. I just slid my hand into my pocket, touched Pop's coin, And in my head, a hoarse voice rose from 21 years ago. Now they'll have to see you. My father had just invited me to the very place that had engraved my name, and he didn't even know it. Saturday morning. My father honked the horn out front at 7:30, scattering a pair of doves off the railing. I brought a plain black canvas bag, nothing special about it. Inside was my pistol, one I had shot through more mornings than the number of mornings I had spent in this house. I wore gray sweatpants, running shoes with a hole worn through one toe, a black hoodie. Nothing on me said anything at all. That was exactly the point. My father sat behind the wheel of a glossy black pickup, one thick arm hanging out the window. He wore the tactical vest still creased from the packaging, and I noticed the price tag still dangling from the inside collar. He hadn't even bothered to cut it off. He looked me over from feet to head, and his lip curled. "Looking a little soft there," he said. "Off to yoga." I got in, shut the door, said not a word. For 45 minutes, I sat quietly and listened to my father lecture about guns. He called my ammunition plastic toys and praised a bigger caliber as though it had been handed down from God on a stone tablet. He said words he had picked up from clips on his phone, and he said them with the certainty of a man who had never had anyone shoot back at him. My brain ran the numbers automatically, the numbers I once used to decide which round punches through level 4 body armor at 300 meters, and which one bounces off like a thrown stone. I said nothing. I looked out the window, counting the wind through the treetops out of habit, and I breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. On the way, he repeated it twice more. "You're a woman, honey." Loud bang. "You'll flinch. You'll panic." That's biology. He said the word biology like a man with a doctorate, though he hadn't opened a book in 40 years. The Ridgeline Range was a low concrete building behind a gravel lot full of pickups. I pushed through the heavy double doors, and the smell of lead and gunpowder rushed in, the smell most ordinary people flinch away from, but that my nervous system processes as the smell of home. My father's friends had gathered at Lane 4, in the indoor pistol range. 4 middle-aged men in cargo pants. The first one called me sweetheart before I had even set my bag down. The second looked me over from my worn shoes up to my face and smirked. My father puffed out his chest, introduced me with a wave of his hand, the baby girl, dragging her out of that storeroom for a little fresh air. They laughed. All of them. I set my bag on the wooden bench. My face was empty. No anger, no hurt. Just the flat gaze of a person reading the room out of habit. I counted the exits, the fire extinguishers, the firing positions. Reflex. Years of training had made it as automatic as breathing. Then I saw it. In the back, through a doorway leading to the long-range bays, an old glass case hung on the wall. Inside were brass plaques. I didn't need to read them to know. I knew the name on one of them. It had been there 21 years, and my father, who had come here almost every week for 3 years, had never once set foot in that room. He was a pistol shooter. He never went to the long-range line. He had walked past his own daughter's name all this time and never once stopped to look. I turned away. I said nothing. Behind the counter was a man I hadn't noticed when I first walked in. A man past 50, gray creeping into his buzz cut, a face carved from years of sun and wind and sleepless nights. He was cleaning a gun, and when I walked in, his gaze lingered on me a beat longer than necessary. Not the look the others gave. A different look. The look of a man trying to remember something. Then he went back to his work. My father stepped up to the firing line at Lane 4. The target hung exactly 7 meters away. He picked up a rented pistol, shoved in the magazine, and leaned his body forward into a stance that, if he'd been my student, I would have made him start over from scratch. He rocked back on his heels. His left hand cupped under the bottom of the magazine in a grip so outdated it was dangerous. He yanked the trigger with brute force. Bang! The muzzle kicked up at the ceiling. Bang! His wrist buckled. Bang! His whole upper body shook. He emptied the magazine in one loud, messy burst. He hit the button, pulled the target back, ripped it off the clip, and held it up for his friends to see like a trophy. The group was a disaster. 3 holes way off to the left. 2 rounds missed the paper entirely. At 7 meters, he missed a sheet of paper standing still. His friends clapped, elbowed each other, cheered as if he had just won a national title. Not one of them looked at the actual target. They were cheering the noise, not the accuracy. Then my father turned, pointed at me, gestured that it was my turn with the slow condescension of a king granting a favor to a beggar. I stood up. I drew my own pistol out of the bag. Immediately, my father pressed in behind me again, floating his 2 thick hands over my shoulders. He reached over, pushed my elbow out, forced my wrist into angles that, if I'd followed them, would have jammed the slide into my thumb. Every correction was wrong. He leaned close to my ear, his breath thick with stale coffee, and whispered his final piece of advice with the solemnity of a war council. Hold your breath. Hold it until your face turns blue. Behind us, one of his friends leaned against the concrete divider and laughed. $20 says she drops the gun. The others smirked. They were betting on my humiliation. They were turning my life's profession into a cheap carnival game to stroke an ego that had never been tested. At the last lane, I saw a little girl. About 10 years old, hair in a ponytail, standing next to her father. She held a pair of earmuffs too big for her head, and she was looking up at her father with a waiting expression. Her father pushed her aside, took the gun, and said something I couldn't quite hear, but I could read the shape of his mouth. Let me. This isn't a place for you. The girl took a step back, hugged the earmuffs to her chest, and looked down at the floor. I knew that posture. I had stood exactly like that at 9 years old. Something in my chest tightened, then let go. I turned back to my own firing line. I slid my hand into my pocket one last time, touched Pop's coin, and I stopped playing the part of Katie. My father stepped back half a pace, crossed his arms, and waited for me to either protest or beg. His friends had placed their bets. The whole room was watching. First shot. I closed my eyes for 1,000th of a second. The laughter behind me sank into an underwater hum. My heart rate, which I had held steady through 45 minutes of provocation, dropped. 60. 55. Combat pulse. It always drops before I press the trigger. It's the oldest thing my body knows how to do. I pushed the pistol out into a proper stance. Arms extended, shoulders driving forward, absorbing the recoil before it even began. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight over the balls of my feet. My left knee, the knee that had carried me through 3 deployments and 1 bad landing at Lejeune, ached once, a familiar pulse, as I lowered into the stance, then went quiet. I ignored it, the way I'd ignored it for years. The front sight floated up to the dead center of the target as if a magnet had pulled it there. I let the breath out naturally. I pressed the trigger. No jerk, no pull. Press. Smooth. Slow. Bang. The recoil ran straight down through my wrists, through my locked arms, down my straight spine, into the concrete under my feet. The muzzle snapped back to center in a fraction of a second. The front sight held still. Bang. The same hole. Bang. 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 I fired all 5 rounds with less than 0.2 of a second between each. 3 seconds from start to finish. The slide locked back over the empty magazine with a sharp, clean click. The last shell casing rolled across the concrete, spun 1 slow turn, and went still. The whole range went quiet. Not just our lane. The 2 lanes beside us stopped firing too. A man 2 lanes down lowered his gun and stared. I dropped the magazine. I racked the slide. Cleared the chamber. I set the pistol on the bench. Muzzle pointed downrange. Slide open. Safe. Professional. By the book. My father lunged for the target retrieval button and pressed it. The target slid back. He squinted at it, tilted his head, and his face moved through one state after another. Confusion, then denial, then a desperate smile as he tried to salvage it. "You missed," he stammered. Missed 4 of them. He thought that at 7 meters there should be 5 separate holes, like the ones he had scattered across his own target. He was looking at a single torn hole in the dead center. 1 hole, not 5. Because all 5 of my rounds had gone through the same path, each one following the last, widening a single wound. His friends did not clap. The smiles on their faces froze, then went out completely. One of them opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. No one was betting anymore. No one was laughing anymore. Then came the sound of heavy boots on the concrete, grinding over the scattered shell casings. The range owner walked straight toward our lane. My father saw him coming, and his eyes lit up with desperate relief. He saw this man as a lifeline, someone with authority who would confirm his version of reality. He stuck out a hand to stop him. "Wade. Hey, boss. I'm just teaching my daughter to shoot here." The man walked past his hand as if it didn't exist. He stepped straight to me, took the target out of my father's hand, and held it up under the light. The single torn bullet hole caught the light. He let out a low whistle, the kind of sound a man makes when he sees something that shouldn't exist at a civilian range. Then he turned and walked toward the glass case in the back room. He stood in front of it for a moment. Then he read, loud enough for the whole range to hear, "Kathleen Brennan. 2003. 500 yards. Iron sights." He turned back to my father. "Frank, in 3 years, you never once wondered who the name on that wall was." The blood drained from my father's face. The range owner stepped in front of me. He looked at me closely, like rereading a face he had seen somewhere. Then something clicked into place in his eyes. "Hold on," he said, his hoarse voice dropping. "Sniper school. Winter course. 3 years ago. You were on the podium. Your gunnery, Sergeant Brennan. You taught that course." He straightened up, and his hand, a hand that had held more guns than I could count, came up in a salute, short, crisp, final. "Served under you for a week at Quantico, Gunny. Not a day I've forgotten." My father stammered. His mouth opened and closed. The sentence he meant to say wouldn't come out. He reached for the edge of the bench, and he sank down onto it, as if his legs had just forgotten how to carry his own weight. His friends looked down at the floor. The war stories my father had told for 3 years, the sentences left blank in the middle for them to fill in, now hung in the air and deflated, right in front of the very people he had been performing for. I took off my ear protection, let it hang around my neck. I looked straight at my father. I said only one sentence, quietly, without a trace of gloating in it. "Pop signed me up for that match. You weren't there." Then I turned away. But the reveal at the range wasn't the thing that broke me open. That came later. That night, when my mother knocked on my door, holding a box she had hidden for 21 years. On the drive home, the truck was as silent as the bottom of a well. My father drove with both fists clenched on the wheel, eyes fixed on the line down the middle of the road. He wasn't boasting anymore. The man who had filled the cab with his own voice all morning couldn't squeeze out a single syllable. It took 6 miles before he spoke. And when he spoke, it was not an apology. "Why didn't you tell me?" he hissed, his voice cracking on the last word. "So you could let me stand there and make a fool of myself." There it was. He didn't ask what I had been through. He didn't ask why I had been silent all those years. He wanted to know why I let him embarrass himself. His shame was the crime, not his cruelty. The public humiliation was the wound, not the 21 years he refused to see me. I turned my head and looked at him for a moment. Then I said, without raising my voice, "Because you never asked." He flinched. "You needed me small," I went on, "so you could feel big. You needed a weak daughter, so you could play the strong father in front of your friends. The difference is, you needed an audience to believe you were strong. I only ever needed to be myself. I didn't offer up anything. I didn't tell him about the operations, about the people I had carried out of the fire, about the badge in the drawer. I didn't need him to fall apart. I just needed him to stop. You're not my enemy, Dad, I said, looking out the window. But you're also not someone I have anything left to prove to. He didn't answer. His chin dropped to his chest. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. And I realized, too late, that I felt no victory. I saw a man who had spent his whole life racing his own father's shadow, and had just discovered that the shadow was sitting in the seat right beside him, wearing the face of the daughter he had never been willing to see. That night, my mother knocked on my door. She stood in the doorway, an old shoebox in both hands, her eyes red. She didn't say, "That's just how your father is." She didn't smooth it over. She just held out the box. "I've kept this since your grandfather died," she said softly. "Your father doesn't know I have it. He told me to throw out all of Pop's things. I didn't. Inside were small things. A watch that had stopped. A photo of Pop as a young man, skinny in his uniform. And at the bottom, a worn leather-bound notebook. Pop's shooting data log, the logbook I had thought was lost long ago. I looked at my mother. "Why are you only giving it to me now?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Because when I was your age, someone told me too that there were places girls don't belong." And I believed it. I believed it my whole life. She looked down at her own hands. "I stood and watched your father say those words to you, and I didn't stop him. Because a part of me believed it too. I'm sorry, Katie." She didn't stay. She set the box down, touched my cheek once, and left. It was the first time in my life I had heard my mother apologize for something real. I sat on the floor of my old bedroom, holding Pop's logbook, and I didn't open it right away. I was afraid. Not story afraid. Really afraid. I have to be honest with you about one thing, because otherwise I'm just telling you a comfortable story about justice. The truth is messier than that. For years, I told myself I stayed silent because I loved my family. That correcting the record was like bragging. That keeping the peace mattered more than my ego. But sitting on that floor that night, I began to suspect it was a lie I told myself so I wouldn't have to do the harder thing, to demand to be seen. Silence is not always kindness. Sometimes it's just the coward's way to avoid a conversation that might make you bleed. And I'm not sure Pop was entirely blameless either. He gave me everything, and that saved me. But that same thing slammed some door shut inside my father, a door that had maybe closed before I was even born. The man who opened a door for me was also the man who, without meaning to, made another man feel invisible. No one is entirely a hero in this story. Not even him. Not even me. Then I opened the notebook. Every page was numbers, notes about wind, about ammunition, about still mornings, in the slanted handwriting of a man who was dead. I turned to the last page with writing on it. And there, under the final line of data, Pop had written to me. He knew. Somehow, 3 months before his heart stopped, he knew he wouldn't be here. And he had written, "Katie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I'm sorry for leaving before I could see you become the person I know you'll be. I'm leaving you 2 things. The coin and this one thing. Don't wait for your father to see you. There are people who never learn how to see, not because they're cruel, but because seeing you would force them to see themselves, and that they cannot bear. Don't let your father's inability become the measure of your worth. You don't need anyone's permission to belong where you belong. You already belong there. You always belonged there. I read it 3 times. Then I let the notebook slide down into my lap, and for the first time in 21 years, I cried for him. Not dramatically. Just tears running down in a dark room, for an old man who had taught me to find the quiet space between 2 heartbeats, and who had stayed long enough to tell me I belonged somewhere, even though he didn't live to see it come true. What broke open in me that night wasn't that my father was wrong. I had known that my whole life. What broke open was this. I had spent 21 years making myself useful, to a military, to the troops whose lives I kept, to a family I carried with my silence, and in all that time I had never once allowed myself to simply be seen. Being useful and being seen are not the same thing. I had confused them my whole life. The greatest revenge wasn't shooting a perfect group in front of my father. The greatest revenge was to stop waiting for his applause. It was to close that notebook, and to know, without needing anyone to confirm it, that my name had been on that wall for all those years, and it was there not because anyone gave permission, but because I had shot my way onto it. 3 months later, I drove back to Ridgeline. Alone. This time I didn't go into the indoor pistol range. I went to the long-range line, 500 yards, with iron sights, exactly the way I had stood at 17 with Pop. The morning air was still. I read the wind. I let the breath out. I found the quiet space between 2 beats, and I fired a string for him. Just for him. No one was watching, and this time I didn't need anyone to watch. As I packed up my gear, I saw the girl. The same ponytail, the same oversized earmuffs, standing in the corner next to her father. Her father was holding the gun again, saying something again, and the girl was looking down at the floor again. I walked over. I knelt down in front of the girl, at her eye level. Her father gave me an annoyed look, but I paid it no mind. I took Pop's coin out of my pocket. The brass coin worn smooth at the edges, with something stamped on both faces that I had long since learned to read. I placed it in the palm of the girl's hand, closed her small fingers around it, exactly the way an old man had done to me 29 years ago. "You belong here," I said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Not even the person you love most." Understood. The girl looked down at the coin in her hand, then up at me, and she nodded, slowly, the kind of nod of a child who has just been given something she doesn't fully understand but knows is important. I stood up, brushed off my knee, and walked out. The morning sun hit my face. My father and I are still not okay. I don't want to lie to you and say the reveal at the range healed 21 years. It didn't. We talk sometimes, short, careful calls, about the weather, about everything that doesn't matter. He has never said those words to me again. But he has also never said the other words, the ones I think I'm still waiting for, even though I know I shouldn't wait anymore. Some wounds don't heal cleanly. Some fathers never learn how to see. Pop warned me about that. It just took me another 21 years to believe him. With my mother, it's different. Something small but real has started between us. Something fragile, built from one honest apology in a shoebox hidden for 21 years. We are learning each other again. Slowly. But truly. And the coin now sits in the pocket of a 10-year-old girl at a local range. A child whose name I don't know. A child who won't have to wait until she's 38 to learn that she doesn't need anyone's permission to belong where she belongs. That is the legacy. Not the badge in the drawer. Not the name on the wall. But a coin passed from one hand to another, over the heads of men who refuse to see, carrying a single simple truth. You belong here, and you always belonged here. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If there's one thing I learned after all of it, it's this. Don't confuse being needed with being seen. They are not the same thing, and you deserve both. Have you ever been looked down on by the very people you gave everything to? Have you ever had to stay silent, to let your family believe in a smaller version of you, just to keep the peace? And if someone ever told you that you don't belong in a place where, in truth, you belong more than they do, I want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. You're not alone. And if you know a woman somewhere who's been shrinking herself so other people feel comfortable, send her this story. Sometimes a person only needs to hear that she already belongs where she's standing. If this story touched something in you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the stories to come. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.